Hello, everyone. My name again is Sebastian Bay. I am the adjunct professor here at the Georgetown University Wargaming Society. And today, as our speaker, we have Jason Matthews, who is a board game designer, most famous for his award-winning Twilight Struggle, which is sitting on my bookshelf right behind me, and which has topped the ratings list for Board Game Geek for many years and is one of the favorites of many wargamers across the world. So we are incredibly excited to have him join us for our Goose webinar series. As a reminder for some rules of conduct, all your video and audio has been disabled. The only way you guys will be able to interact is through the chat function. So if you have a question for Jason that he'll be taking throughout his presentation, please write it in the chat. And we recommend that you say you label it as a question or put the letter Q in front of it. That'll help us identify the questions in the traffic of all the chats. But otherwise, I hand it over to Jason, and thank you again.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in. And I'm very excited to have been invited by the Georgetown University Wargaming Society to make this presentation. I think that the work that they're doing, linking professional wargaming and the hobby is amazing and important and useful for all of us, that cross-pollination. So I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit about this subject. As folks who know a little bit about the games that I've designed already know, I'm very interested in the intersection of politics and conflict. And part of that is, of course, because it's a little bit about my occupation. I have spent my entire career in government and politics in one form or another. And of course, I've been a wargamer since since Axis and Allies came out in 1984. And so this allows me to marry those two interests together. And you know, we're sort of in a golden age of Paul Mills simulations. And so it seemed to me a good time to give a little address on the evolution of that kind of conflict simulation. So without too much further ado, let me run through these slides. I've got the slides divided into 3 different sections. And so I'll stop and take questions at the end of each section so that it's a little more interactive. And then, of course, you can hold forth on anything you like at the end of the presentation. So here we go. As I mentioned before, I've got 3 sections. We're going to begin with kind of an orientation for the origins of the divide between political and military simulation. Then take a quick look at how the hobby has integrated politics initially and more contemporaneously, and then discuss a little bit about the frontier for this kind of gaming. So it's kind of a weird thing. It has only been fairly recently that we have started looking at games where we call them Paul Mills simulations, and we're doing both things at the same time. And the mere fact that we have the term Paul Mills simulation is really sort of interesting, because the term suggests that there's politics and there's military, and the two things, you know, have to be somehow integrated because they're really separate concepts and separate schools of thought. But of course, when we go back to the origins of political theory and military theory, when you look at the classics from Karl von Clausewitz, you start with the seminal quote that war is a continuation of politics by other means. And so it's kind of curious that we're in a circumstance where we talk about politics and military affairs as if they're completely separate entities. And an important part of this, a very substantial part of this, has to do with the American context that we are both the sort of inventors of the modern board gaming hobby, that we're the preeminent world power, and we have a humongous aversion to mixing politics and military power. That said, it should be fairly obvious to everybody who knows something about history that that's not really how the world has operated. Military might and political power have been the same thing through most of human history, and not just in the West. This is a universal experience throughout the world, where might is the primary path towards political power. And so those two things get interwoven very, very closely in most governments through most of human history. All these guys here have no idea what a Paul Mills simulation is. Why would they? There's no such distinction as a political military simulation for Caesar or Charlemagne or Suleiman the Great or Zenobia even. These are two sides of the exact same coin. And it kind of goes without saying that this relationship between monarchies and military power is close even today, even in the British monarchy, which we think of as a state that closely resembles the United States. There remains this kind of interweaving of political power and military power. As late as the First World War, Tsar Nicholas led troops at the front himself, because this was an important component of how you maintain the legitimacy of a monarchy, by demonstrating your capacity for military leadership. But as we all know, the United States is a product of the Enlightenment. And during the Enlightenment, one of its seminal characteristics is the Enlightened scholars were very concerned about rediscovering the classics, the work of the Greeks and the Romans. And of course, the US government is eventually modeled on Greek and Roman political theory. So while a lot of what the United States is reacting to in the Constitution and in our early government structure is aimed at the British monarchy, that's definitely a consideration for the founders. A lot of other lessons that they're taking are lessons from history that come directly out of the classics. So while they were worried about George III, the monarch that really is at the front of their head in a lot of their political discourse and in the Federalist Papers and a lot of the founding documents is Julius Caesar, because we're creating a republic for the first time in millennia. And the last time a republic was created and fell was thanks to this guy. And so at the forefront of their thinking is, we have to avoid the traps that the Romans fell into, or the Greeks for that matter. And we're going to, and one of the most obvious traps is when you concentrate military power in a person's hands, you also tend to concentrate political power. So we want those things to be very, very much separate. This is a quote from James Madison about how the fact that every time you create a standing army, it's used to excite a war and then used to oppress and enslave the people. And this is very much the attitude of the founders when they're creating our government. So instead, the United States looks to the Cincinnatus model, which is to say a military figure who voluntarily relinquishes political power, or his military power when he takes political power. And that's why Washington is referred to as the modern Cincinnatus. It's why we have a city called Cincinnati. We can go on and on about this, but this is a very important concept in early American history for our first political thinkers. So this almost religious belief from the founders about the separation of political and military power is placed into our Constitution. It is, armies are supposed to be raised, they're not supposed to be standing. We can go on and on. There are a variety of these examples within the Constitution, but it also it can be found in traditions like we didn't allow the Secretary of Defense to be a former military, a former general or former admiral up until the Trump administration. And even that kind of required a waiver, and it was controversial because of this very deep concern about immersing political and military power. But that same issue has carried over into our wargaming. So I'll stop there for a second, and Sebastian or Moshe, do we have any questions?
We have no so far, so press on.
Okay, good deal. So we have this strange fear, and that fear ends up being reflected in our wargaming, and it doesn't really make any sense at all because, of course, politics plays a part, obviously, at any strategic level simulation, and equally in most operational contexts. Obviously, the Tet Offensive was not about holding ground in South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive was a political campaign. When Lee moved into Pennsylvania, it wasn't about Lee occupying Pennsylvania. It was about the federal elections and trying to get Abraham Lincoln tossed out of office. So with all, even the invasion of Normandy has all of these political contexts. So even at the tactical level, there are political questions that very well integrate into wargaming and conflict simulation. The origin of our hobby is a political military simulation. If you start with chess, or even Go actually, as the origin of where this hobby ultimately developed, you can see we're talking about a king and a queen and then military units. And chess even has a wry commentary on political power. Obviously the queen is a much more powerful piece than the king, although he ultimately is the most important piece. So in spite of that context, we end up with a situation where gaming and politics don't initially mix. And part of the origin of this comes from the era in which wargaming developed, which was the era of Robert McNamara. He had been the president of Ford Motor Company and then became Robert Kennedy's Secretary of Defense. And he very much was interested in bringing the lessons that he had acquired at Harvard Business School and at Ford Motor Company and trying to apply them to modern warfare. So, he wanted metrics. He wanted the application of systems analysis. He wanted war to work very much like a business. And of course, it didn't really. And that is why Robert McNamara perhaps led us into the worst political decision of the 20th century, because he tended to ignore the political component of warfare. Well, the initial cast of characters who were involved in the hobby Jim Dunnigan, John Prados, Peter Perla, Randall Reed, just to name a few, but actually there are dozens of these guys. Almost all of them had some relationship with the DoD. Either they worked there initially, they worked in with computer simulation on strategic weapons, they ultimately became consultants, and so they're part of this same culture, and they bring that culture into the wargaming hobby as we know it. This over here is a battle damage assessment. It's something, you know, kind of notorious from the Vietnam War. They still, of course, use them today. But this was kind of a Robert McNamara brainchild and very typical of the kind of policy he was interested in. And then on the right, you can see a combat results table from Tactics 2, I think. And you can see that this kind of notion that warfare is merely a mathematical question. It's something that can be reduced to scientific principle. It's something that we can basically take a slide rule out and figure out who's going to win a battle. It was the thinking at the DoD, and initially it's how war games are designed. The other issue is that, of course, DoD is crawling with engineers, and that affects their perspective on politics very much. Just a quick statistic that even now, 66% of the Naval Academy graduates are engineers. Engineers tend to live in a world of right answers, and in politics, there are very few right answers. And I think this contributes sort of to a mentality where people are not interested in politics. They have a certain disdain for it at the DoD, and the military class in the United States have a certain reflexive disdain for politics. And that's not exactly a new thing. That's, well, you can see from this quote from Grant that has pretty much been the historical tradition of the United States. You can find it in the letters of George Washington to Congress also, where they sort of breed over with contempt for politicians and interference in military affairs. So, as I mentioned earlier, most early war games simply ignore politics. It's as if it doesn't exist. Particularly true in the kind of early Avalon Hill war games, Tactics 2, Blitzkrieg. And it's true at all levels. It's not just a matter of, oh, okay, well, we're doing a tactical tank battle. Even when you're trying to deal with politics at the strategic level, it's ignored because, you know, you can deal with politics merely by victory point hexes or the victory conditions for the game. But a funny thing happens after the failure of US policy in Vietnam. Both the DoD and Wargaming begin to understand that there's a need to contend with politics in the simulations. In the 1990s, the Army created the Civil Affairs and PsyOps Command. There had been units along these lines all along, and Special Forces had done some of this work earlier on in the country's history. But in the 90s, we kind of formalize the structure of it. We create all of these reserve units, and DoD realizes that this is an important component of warfare. And similarly, we start seeing wargamers start dipping their toes into politics and integrating politics into wargame design. These first efforts, as you can see from this chart on the right are very much sort of like combat results tables. Politics is a mystery. We're going to roll a die and see what happens, because that's how politics works. It's a lightning bolt that affects what I was trying to do. And you can understand how that is kind of a reflection of a bias that people who grew up in a DoD environment that is very skeptical of politics, how that bias would carry over into war game design, because we're doing essentially the same thing. We don't really understand how politics works. It seems very opaque to us, and it seems almost irrational. And so that is how it's going to be reflected in war game design, as an irrational factor that comes in and messes up your plans. There's a second approach that develops here as well, which is to just hardwire politics into rule books. And that required players to learn an additional half rule book and commit it to memory. And in this case, it's kind of politics by military engineering, which is to say that, you know, there are known answers, and there are rules, and it works just like, you know, a civil engineering regulatory book or something. And unfortunately, that leads to a kind of easy player manipulation. And again, much like the combat results table random effect, a hardwired form of politics also displays a degree of naivete about how politics works and what would be a good way to simulate it. So eventually, in the 90s, we overcome all of this with one incredibly important innovation from Mark Herman, who I know has spoken already, and for whom I can only credit my getting into game design in the first place, because his We the People, which is a strategic level card-driven war game about the American Revolution, really reinvigorated my interest in war games, and also illustrated what is possible in terms of bringing the political aspect of war games to the forefront. These are a couple of illustrations of the cards that are included in that game. So Mark's game comes out in 1993, exactly at the same time that the DoD is starting to focus on Paul Mill affairs and create civilian affairs units, as I mentioned. And the first important part of the innovation of his game is that he puts politics on cards. And why that's so important is that a card in that game and in most card-driven games is essentially a little rule, but it's a little rule that you don't have to memorize. And that's incredibly important for speed of play and ease of play and kind of player engagement. And in addition to the fact that you don't have to memorize the rule because it's right there on the card that you're reading, you can also contextualize the politics and the rule to the time in the game. In Twilight Struggle, we have decks split into time so that things kind of happen in a logical, chronological order, and contextualized by the board situation. So you can say this rule applies, in kind of an if-then format, because I'm trying to make a point about how politics interjects in the battlefield, but that point is only relevant if A, B, and C are true. And that gives a dynamism to political simulation that was not available in either the other two approaches, which were chart-based or sort of hardwired rule-based before. It also, for the first time, acknowledged something that was very important, that, you know, revolutions and insurrections are basically political games, and they serve political aims almost exclusively. And so politics for the American Revolution or the Vietnam War or a variety of other conflicts, politics really should be central to the design rather than ancillary. And his design ultimately unleashes a whole sub-hobby of games that we call card-driven games, and also the coin series, which is derived initially from card-driven games. You know, as I mentioned at the front, we're kind of living in a golden era of Paul Mills simulations. There's another element of Mark's design that is really important that gets less attention, which is the quantification and abstraction of political influence. Euro design had kind of been, this is like central to a lot of things in Euro design and area control games that are part of that genre in board gaming more generally. But in wargaming, this seemed to be an intellectual hurdle that we didn't, you can find examples where it was kind of crossed, but in We the People, he really makes clear that, these little numbers on these military chits are abstractions. They represent some element of military power, but you couldn't quantify it precisely. It's kind of quantified in relative terms to other military units. And if we can do that for military power, why can't we do the exact same thing for political power? So Mark explores that at the margins in We the People. It has kind of a Go-like mechanism that is important to that design. And that allows Ananda and I to take his insight to the nth degree, eliminate military units altogether, and focus on political influence, as in Twilight Struggle. So we'll take a little break and see if there are any questions. Moshe or Sebastian?
Hi, everyone. Just making sure everyone can see me okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Moshe Klein. I'm part of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society. I'm pleased to moderate a little bit today. I'm going to start off with a question, but if anyone else has questions, please pump them in the chat. I'm seeing some already coming in. Something I've been thinking about while listening is different theoretical conceptions of politics, right? So we have like realists and constructivists and liberals and all those kind of, and each one is going to have its own implications inside of a game. We also have things like, how political leaders, how much do they matter? So in Twilight Struggle, like each turn has its own political leader as its icon. And so how do you decide, how do you pick a lane when it comes to constructing a game that is both telling of reality, but also without just focusing exclusively on one theoretical dimension?
So that's an extremely interesting question, and I do think that it's an area that political simulations thus far, or Paul Mills simulations, we sort of pick a lane without necessarily offering a lot of express philosophy to players. But for instance, Twilight Struggle is a realist game, right? For sure. Not only is it realist, we basically say that the Soviet Union and the United States stand on the same exact moral ground. And their power is essentially the same. A lot of other schools of thought would dicker with that quite a bit. And it would be cool to see a game that went in exactly the opposite direction, right? That, you know, that was more asymmetric, where the US is able to do these things and the Soviets are able to do these things because there are important differences in our political system. But that space is not as well explored yet, and it definitely is a place for designers to spend some time and look at, okay, how can we account for the differences in political decision making, and what impact would that have on resolving a conflict?
Cool, great. I'm going to combine David Larson's and George Walkley's questions because they're very similar. So regarding kind of the random political events and how people used to adjudicate those kind of randomly, where does the SPI Power Politics series sit in this schema? For example, the Russian Civil War, Minuteman, Tito, Battlefield Mars, and then also George Walkley adds, where does diplomacy fit into these kind of the evolution of hobby games?
So, so the SPI political series is super interesting, and I love Russian Civil War with a purple passion, but I don't know that it, the politics in those games is very gamey. In Russian Civil War, you have no set side, and you're kind of, you kind of flip back and forth between whether you're reds and whites, and that's saying something very interesting about the Russian Civil War and the actual ideology of the leadership of it. But in terms of a simulation of the Russian Civil War, I'm not sure that that works quite as well. SPI did a lot of interesting things. They had a game on the Canadian Civil War also, or a hypothetical Canadian Civil War, that had a lot of interesting concepts, but most of those innovations get kind of left on the cutting room floor. They're tried in one game and you don't see them carried through or evolved in a lot of other games of the era. And that's kind of that's disappointing and a misfortune. The second question was, I'm sorry, Moshe.
Just regarding diplomacy, but it's kind of like the same question.
Diplomacy, diplomacy is a superb game. It was written by, I think he was a Harvard historian, or designed by a Harvard historian of European history. And that has a similar problem. It stands out as this singular, extraordinarily interesting simulation of the issues with entangling alliances and the geographic imperatives of European diplomacy and policy. And then it gets dropped for hexes and counters and zones of control. I can't tell you why those lessons from a game like diplomacy do not get applied very much in the rest of the hobby, other than there is kind of a weird reluctance in a lot of the hobby to play games that are based on negotiation. And again, this has to do with to a certain extent, the type of people who were designing games before, which have kind of an engineering background, and a lot of people who are playing games who also have kind of computer engineering outlooks.
Great. Neil Gold asks about if you have any comments about how to best simulate different political effects of damage to the leadership of a faction versus the damage to its military capabilities versus damage to the general population, the three legs of the Clausewitz Trinity.
That is such a super interesting idea conceptually. Like how can we better? There are a ton of games where you have a situation where you're concerned about overall kind of national morale, and as morale drags down, you have a problem. I mean, this is true even in a battlefield context, but in a strategic level game where you have a national morale, and as your morale degrades, your capacity for warfighting degrades. But you raise an interesting point in that there is a distinction sometimes between national morale and the quality of leadership and the leadership's morale. And those distinctions are even broader in a context where information is widely controlled so that, when do the Germans realize they're losing the war? Either of the two world wars, honestly. And how do you simulate that effect? I definitely have to give it more thought. I can't think of a single game where that is an important component of the way the game works, but it's so worth exploring.
Cool, thank you. James Mersol asks if he wants to hear more about politics and games, how it's abstracted, especially electoral politics. And he mentioned votes for women, which I see is on the slide, but also like, the making of the president. So how do you factor in electoral pieces to that as well?
Well, electoral politics, the nice thing about electoral politics is that it helps, it gives a quantifiable direction for players. And that is super helpful in helping new players kind of identify and develop a strategy. I don't have to tell you what states are important in 1960. The electoral votes tell you what states are important in 1960. And so you, otherwise, in a situation where you're dealing with politics in the abstract, or it's a national issue where you have to move all the states in a certain direction, like in votes for women, but every state is equally valued in a constitutional amendment, for instance, then you have to send different political cues and triggers to help players develop a strategy so that they know what they're doing when they open the box. The abstraction of it, well, I mean, in the case of electoral politics, the nice thing about it is not particularly abstract, it's concrete. It's this many votes, get them or don't. The part that is abstracted in those games is how does political effort translate into votes? And I would say that my design, 1960 is, or Campaign Manager for that matter, they're both a little bit naive about that, right? It's a one-for-one, essentially a one-for-one trade-off. I make this effort and predictably guaranteed I have this political result. That's not actually how politics works. Sometimes you can put in an enormous effort and nothing happens. The needle doesn't move at all. And part of that might be because you don't understand your audience very well, or you're swimming upstream in the first place, or there are these other factors that are in play. It might very well be, I'm not saying this is true, it might very well be that Jimmy Carter ran a better campaign than Ronald Reagan in 1980. We'll never know because he was flying in the face of so many other factors. The quality of his campaign just didn't matter.
Yeah, we started a theme of kind of these theoretically driven board game mechanics, especially around politics. Stephen Downs Martin asks, what effect does realism has on hobby game design when the designer knows that no one's actually going to die if they get the design wrong, or it's not true for the the professional or DoD war gamers?
That has a lot of super interesting impacts. There is always this mindset in a game context that is super problematic because you're just trying to win the game, and so the parameters of the game have a distorting effect on decision making for most war games. And that's why that was something we were kind of aiming at when we designed Imperial Struggle. Imperial Struggle is something, a sequel that I did with Ananda that came out this last year. And that game takes players through the rivalry between Britain and France from the War of Spanish Succession to the Napoleonic Wars, or the cusp of the Napoleonic Wars. But the important part about it is that it has a sequence of war and peace and war and peace and war and peace, so that you see the interrelationship between what the decisions that you're making in wartime and how they relate to peace, and how the decisions you make in peacetime impact your capacity for war. Because that's really, that's really an important element of decision making in wartime, and most of our war games are not particularly good at capturing the fact that a fleet in being is more important than winning any particular battle, because you got to keep fighting the war, or you got to fight the next war, or you got to deter other enemies beside the one you're playing the game against. And some games have worked on this problem a little bit. Professional war games work on this problem quite a bit, but it is an area that hobby games could think more about and pay more attention to.
On that note, Thomas, I'm going to butcher the last name, so I apologize, but Dziobla, he asks whether coin games fit, we mentioned asymmetric power concepts with, different factions being able to do different things. How do coin games fit into that mold?
Yeah, I think coin is a fascinating evolution in political game design, and important innovation, because it takes political game design in a different direction. Mark's innovation was the use of cards to simulate politics. Volko's innovation with the use of the coin system was to kind of simulate politics by illustrating different player capacities through the limitations of what actions that they can take in a game. That route is by no means fully explored. Obviously, there are a ton of games in the pipeline that are coin based games, and it'll be exciting to see what kind of new twists and twerks come from all of that. But I think it's definitely a promising field of design, trying to figure out how to simulate asymmetry by limitations on player decision.
When it comes to kind of simulating politics, and Ken Burnside asks a really interesting questions, because he's looking to make a game about player generated politics, but he's looking for recommendations, techniques, especially because it's hard to make cards when you don't know who the political factions are before you set up. How much creativity do you give to the players versus how much do you leave in the design? I think of games like Twilight Imperium, which are like very very grand, but also heavily kind of structured in terms of this faction does this faction does that. So how do you create player generated politics? How do you kind of give the player the toolkit to create politics without it being too overwhelming?
That's an interesting question. There was a cool game, what I thought was a cool game, called Days of Decision, and it was like a political add-on to a monster war game for World War II, and it was kind of like a menu. You sat down as the United States or Russia or wherever, and you went through all of these political options, and the choices that one player made could impact the available options to you and vice versa. And so it was kind of like a game of competing decision trees, I guess. And all of that provided kind of political pretext to a game about World War II. It seems to me that you could do something very similar in kind of a war of competing decision trees, where the impacts can limit the choices of other players, and different impacts have different advantages, et cetera, et cetera. for a game that would have a more open approach to the political structure that players could pursue in a Paul Mills simulation.
Ken has a quick follow-up about what you think about drafting cards by players to shuffle into like a shared deck, whether that would be a good method of doing something like that.
I definitely think that is a potentially interesting mechanism, particularly so if everybody's drawing from a shared deck and you have kind of a collective deck building exercise, that could be very interesting. I've seen something like that used not so much for political purposes, but for kind of an economic engine in Euro games. So yeah, maybe you've chanced upon a new application for that mechanic to politics.
Sue Ganley asks what you think about multiplayer solo games like, Republic of Rome, where you can have like a nice mix of operations and politics. You want Rome to survive. You also need to cooperate. So but you also want your faction to become, come on the top. Whether that's kind of a good example of this.
I mean, Republic of Rome is a superb game. The way my group, when we played it regularly, it was highly interactive. We called it Klingon Senate because we were constantly killing one another. So, I mean, I think Republic of Rome is, with all due respect to the genius of its design at its time, it's a little fiddly and it's a little long for contemporary tastes, but it does do this one thing amazingly well, which is put players in a very certain and identifiable player position. You know your perspective clearly. It's not like I'm amorphous, I'm the whole government. I'm this Roman family, and the success of Rome is important to me, but the success of my family is important to me. And I'd be hard pressed to identify a game that succeeds in putting players in the right perspective more successfully, and which manages this kind of question of semi-cooperative design, where you have a common goal of maintaining Rome at the same time that you're trying to climb over the other players. It does that extraordinarily well. I've often thought and certainly hope someone will update that game and bring it into contemporary design.
Back to we have a lot of theory-driven questions. I didn't mean to start anything here, but Alan Morehouse asks here. He says that very often in war games, personalities come to the forefront when it comes to like special abilities. But in political games, personalities and their positions should be the center of the game, according to Alan, but are not. And and you kind of lose the political leaders and the actual individuals. Is this not a problem? Like, should we be focusing on that more, or should we not?
Maybe. I don't know. That gets back to one of the earlier theoretical questions about the nature of political leadership. Is it, personality driven? Is electoral politics personality driven? There's certainly good arguments to say that it is, but of course, not all politics is on the American political model either, and not all political cultures are the same as the United States. So you can only generalize so far in that regard. But the game, I guess, that comes to mind where the sides have sort of a personality that's based on the political leadership is Churchill, where how the Soviets operate and how the British operate and how the US operates is very much reflective of the political leadership of those three factions.
So you anticipated the next question, which was Jeff Trayer's question about your thoughts on the Great Statesman series by Mark Herman, which includes Churchill, as well as Versailles 1919. And it creates kind of a dynamic of co-opetition. And so is that a good dynamic? Like, what do you think of that kind of model?
Yeah, it is interesting because it allows us to get at this question of alliances and how they work. Most war games are very cynical about it. And it's not clear to me that that's the right attitude, that in point of fact, alliances do, countries do collaborate to accomplish important things together. And that doesn't dismiss kind of the global pecking order that we all have operating in our brains, but it doesn't mean that that collaboration isn't very real. And so, Mark is trying to do something very interesting there in Churchill, but it honestly does echo back a little bit to the way Republic of Rome works.
Yeah, those are all the questions we have so far. I could keep asking questions infinitely, but I definitely want to, if there's anything else that you think that we want to continue the presentation, or where you want to go from here.
Yeah, we'll continue the presentation and then we'll have another round of questions after that.
It sounds good.
So I wanted to talk about, I mean, we had some of this in the question and answer period, but I wanted to talk about sort of where I see politics and political military simulations going in the future. The most obvious thing, and like breathtaking really from when I was initially in the hobby, and the only topics that you could get a game on were Stalingrad, some infinite number of East Front games, or Gettysburg and various Civil War campaigns. Now we're just exploring all over the place, and these designs are getting picked up by major war game publishers, and that's such an exciting thing to see. So I mentioned just a few. There's a game called Revolution 1979, I think, about the Iranian Revolution. There's GMT is publishing a game on people power, the overthrow of Marcos in the Philippines. Votes for Women, you saw the photo earlier, is about the franchise, the effort to give the franchise to women in the United States. But that's really, honestly, just the tip of the iceberg. There are a ton of these games in the pipeline, having been picked up, and excitingly, that have an audience. It would be, it would be unthinkable when I was in the hobby in 1988 or whatever that we would have a game about decolonization in India. But we've got one now, and it's successful, and that's a very exciting thing. And since I am nerdy and I like obscure history, and the more obscure the better, I'm super excited to see these designs coming down the pipeline. I'm also excited that I don't have to do it myself, that other people are designing games like this for me. We touched on this other question. Cards were a giant step forward in how we simulate politics in gaming, but it can't be the only answer. And Coin points to another potentiality, that we can create asymmetry and simulate political power by limiting and distinguishing player ability. But that's clearly not the only way. That is also not the only way that we can get at politics. And I think more games that focus on perspective, rather than you simply I'm simply like the entire country. I'm its whole governmental structure. Will be very interesting. Gene at GMT Games has a game coming out just on presidential decision making, and so it is uniformly focused on the decisions that a president can make. And we don't have a lot of games like that so far in the contemporary board game industry, and it would be great to see an explosion of interest on Paul Mill simulations that really focused in on particular perspectives of the Paul Mill conflict. I think something else that I'm very excited about is that we have a lot of new designers. With Sebastian, I recently participated in the Zenobia Awards, which were, it was an awards program that encouraged the hobby to diversify a little bit. For the most part, it's old white guys like me, and it's great to see the potentiality for women and people of color from all across the country and LGBT participants actually entering into historical game design. It's great not just because of the diversity itself and the potential inclusion of a more diverse hobby, but also because those designers bring different perspectives on history, and that means that we'll get different perspectives in game design ultimately, and that diversity and flowering is always a great thing from my point of view. In addition to the Zenobia Awards, we just have an explosion of interest in the hobby as it becomes increasingly global. It used to be, when I was a young player in the hobby, it was us, the United States and Canada, the Brits, and to a lesser degree, the French. And there was always a smattering of interest in the hobby in Japan. Now, of course, it's all over Europe. Mexico and Brazil and Chile have the beginning of an important hobby. Of course, we're seeing designs from China, Taiwan, South Korea, India, and even recently from Africa. So that is, fantastic news for all of us. And it means, again, more diversity of subject matter. The history that's important to the people in those places is not necessarily the same as the history that's important to us. And I'll be excited to hear their stories and play their stories on board games. Some particular areas of potential innovation and exploration, I think, for game designers. In the board gaming context generally, more generally, role-playing as applied to a board gaming context has taken off. Gloomhaven is kind of the brand leader, but you can see this in all sorts of games at the moment. And, every generation has a tendency to rediscover things. And so right now, role-playing is being rediscovered by board gamers, and that's exciting. But in the professional wargaming space, role-playing techniques have been used for a very, very long time. And to a certain extent, it's what wargaming is typified by in the professional context. But as of yet, we have not done a lot of exploration of how political military simulations can fit into the role-playing, this kind of new board game role-playing space. And I think that's a potentially interesting area for designers to explore. Similarly, and back to this problem that we were discussing earlier about, okay, how do you fix the kind of fight to the last man problem in historical game design? We have legacy games, which are an interesting element of board game design, but we have not applied those same innovations and techniques to political military consims. And, it's a legacy game that just focused on the history of Europe in the 20th century would be fascinating and so fun to play. but we don't have that kind of game yet. And lastly, again, something that we alluded to during the last question and answer session is, cooperative games. It's an extremely interesting arena. It has a particular appeal to a certain segment of the gaming population that loves to play cooperative design. And there are a lot of political and military situations that would benefit from cooperative design where people are working to achieve the same goal. That could be in the context of a tactical war game where everybody's playing members of a platoon, or an alliance that's trying to defeat a common enemy. Is it possible that we could design a World War II game where no one played the Germans? Anyway, I think this is somewhere that game designers can take some lessons that are already circulating and create hybrids. And that ends my slide deck. So I'm happy to take another round of questions. My email is here. My Twitter handle was at the first slide, which is just at JasonDC1970. We'll look forward to more discussion.
We definitely have several more questions at least. But I want to kind of start us off with the ever illustrious, our faculty advisor, Sebastian Bay, who asks a very, I think, a good kind of intro question, which is what is a typical what is typical of political dynamics, excuse me, or dimension that you want to see more in hobby wargaming? So what new dynamics, dimensions, elements are you looking, would you like to see more of?
I think it's one of the tensions that I think is underrepresented in political wargaming is the difference in strategy between political actors and military actors. And I was doing there was a recent book about the Korean War and Truman and Truman and MacArthur's relationship that really highlighted this question for me. And because the United States has this profound distinction between political and military relations, this kind of notion of the professional military class in the United States that, leave it to us, we know what we're doing, stay out of our business, and the political class continually inserting itself because the political class or the military class doesn't seem to understand the political imperatives of decision making. That tension is almost never simulated in games, but it's a very real component of political decision making in the United States and the way we go about fighting wars.
Gabriel Landowski asks about games which incorporate the politics of cyber operations into gameplay. So, who has the authority, but also kind of the legal aspects that come of it. And I'm also going to add, maybe games that you don't know who's attacking you, where there's kind of like where it's not clear where it's coming from.
I mean, it's such a great topic. I've seen some rudimentary efforts to get at it. I don't think that the designs thus far that I have seen, I guess I feel like they're still operating under kind of the rubric and context of traditional warfare and traditional war games. And I feel like these problems are something else. They don't lend themselves to, they surely don't lend themselves to, hex encounters, but I don't even think that they lend themselves to the kind of modeling that we do right now in board gaming. And it needs to be rethunk from the beginning. I know someday someone will crack this particular code and provide us with a really interesting game on cyber warfare, but we're kind of waiting. And I'm not the guy because I just am not smart like that.
James Versol asks about games where the political leader develops their cabinet or the country evolves over the course of the campaign or over the course of a period of time, which is kind of interesting. People's abilities might change. Wait, like, is that something that you've seen before? How would that be incorporated into a game?
One of my favorite political games is a computer game called No Greater Glory, and it was an old, I think, SSI game from, I want to say, the early 90s, I would say. And it's an American Civil War game. And the whole focus of the game is two gigantic problems: managing your cabinet so that you get, and that has like a two-axis problem. The first is that you want the smartest people and the most ablest people in the right position, right? So everybody's got a rating for where you could put them, A. And then B, you have to maintain regional diversity because you're trying to maintain this national coalition at the same time that you're getting this, the smartest people in the right job. And you're constantly having to compromise. And that same exact problem occurs with the military leadership. So not every general has got his job because he happens to be a particularly competent general. Sometimes you just need a dummy from Massachusetts to fit the job because you're recruiting in Massachusetts. And you don't, I haven't ever seen another war game. There's some of this in Mark Herman's For the People. There's some of this, but it's certainly not the singular focus of that game. And I've never seen another political simulation, or I've never seen another war game tackle that element of politics quite so thoroughly or successfully, because you really get a different insight into why Lincoln or Jefferson Davis are making the kind of appointments and decisions that they're making during the war. So yes, I would love to see another game that did something like that.
Going back to kind of the historical inspirations, Akar asks about the biases inherent in the kind of the U.S. political military dynamic and how it influenced, historical gaming, how the historical gaming is becoming more popular on the globe. And he wants to know if you've noticed any, or she, if you noticed any subtle differences in how some foreign countries approach history, other than the United States, beyond the typical abstract economic Euro games.
That's super interesting, and I feel like it's coming, but we're not exactly there yet. And in part, it's there's a lag because the United States defined the forms because we're the first mover. We invented the contemporary board gaming hobby. We're while we didn't invent professional wargaming, of course, that was the Prussians, but we were one of the most active users, and of course, U.S. military power and our military philosophy ends up influencing both our NATO allies and all of the countries we provide aid to, and so kind of our mindset has a trickle-down effect globally, except for perhaps with our adversaries. But only perhaps. Even there, I think it has its influences. So as the hobby evolves and we get more designers from outside the usual suspects, once it's fewer Americans and Brits designing war games, then I think we'll start to see a very different perspective on history. I'm sure that will be true in terms of kind of inter-American relations when these Latin American board game designers, which are kind of rising, and there are a number of war game designers or conflict simulation designers in Mexico. I'm sure their point of view on the Mexican-American War, for instance, is quite different than most American war game designers. So it will be cool to have games like that. I actually, as I was saying that, it just reminded me that there is an interesting little CDG on the Spanish-American War, but it covers it's really, it was designed by a Spaniard, and it really covers the entirety of Cuba's kind of insurrection against Spain. And so in that game, and from that designer's point of view, the American intervention is just like the last tail end of a story that had been going on for quite some time. And that gave me a different point of view on the Spanish-American War than I had got derived from US history books.
Yeah, Rex Brynan asks, in terms of political military or political gaming, should we be looking at things like mega gaming or model United Nations? These games or simulations are almost always about mixed sum situations of conflict and cooperation. How do you see those playing out in wargaming?
So it's interesting you say that. I had a weird but cool opportunity and experience. I went to Denmark mostly to go to a game convention, but in addition, I was invited to stay at a school. In Denmark, they have these things called after schools, and they're like this cool historical quirk that resulted from the Dano-Prussian War, Second Danish-Prussian War. But anyway, the idea was that Danish families send like 10th and 11th graders to a boarding school. They're publicly supported boarding schools, and most Danish kids do this. But these boarding schools tend to have like a specialty. So they'll send you to the computer boarding school or the drama boarding school or whatever. So this boarding school taught all of its lessons either through LARP or through a live action role playing or through some form of gamification. And they invited me to do a LARP while I was there, to design one and run one, which I'd never done before. So I fell back on Model United Nations myself, and I ran a Cuban Missile Crisis simulation through kind of a Model UN structure. Yes, I think that kind of hybrid of role playing with actual conflict simulation and real history and real politics is potentially a fertile ground for game design. Clearly people enjoy Model UN, that's why they do it. So there must be something inherent in that activity that you could harness to make a good game.
Matt asks what your thoughts on the recent efforts in simulating politics and solo systems with the Master of series. Have you heard of that before?
I don't think I have.
Okay. Those are, I want to kind of end on one question, which I've been thinking a lot about. And I know Ken Bernstein mentioned elements of this to me, which is just how much do you think the video game industry, which you already mentioned before, the use of wargaming in video games is going to impact this industry? One advantage of it already is just that you can save your games. Many games, war games, are really hard to transport or play for a very long period of time. So you can kind of introduce a much larger scale. Ken mentioned that using cards might be a way to get around that. But even so, there's a video games and war games and online kind of allow that opportunity. Do you think that they're going to replace war games? Do you think there's still a role for war games? And what is that role? If the scale has to be much smaller.
So, obviously there are things that video games and video war games do better. There's no doubt about that. And scalability is definitely one of those questions. Portability and the ability to save and restart, those are advantages. But, the video game hobby, the first online war games started appearing in the 80s. That's 40 years ago. Both of the hobbies, if anything, they've both grown, and they're both more robust now than they were before. So I don't think that one will replace the other at all. And it could be that, it could be that video games end up being more important in professional wargaming than they are for the hobby as a whole, because wargames in the video game context, while there are kind of hex and counter classical war games that are ported over into an electronic format or designed that way in the first place, the most popular war games are just first-person shooter kind of historical nonsense, but fun, right? It provides decoration to gore. So I don't know that the commercial video wargaming hobby is really moving in a direction that's going to be particularly educational or provide much efficacy for anyone who's trying to learn a little history while playing a game. That still seems to be our niche, and the reason why I think this analog form of wargaming perseveres.
With that, can you finish us off with just a couple of suggestions about history political games that David Beard would want specifically that integrate politics and combat well? A lot of hobby games focus on sci-fi and because of the large potential market, but give us some of your favorite, newer games that talk about some of the events and dynamics coming up.
Well, so one video game that I think is fantastic and actually changed my point of view on how the Middle Ages work is Crusader Rex 3. And it really made me comprehend for the first time that the Middle Ages and most of the history of the Middle Ages is about family management, and it's not about warfare at all. It's kind of ancillary. What you're really trying to make sure you do is produce enough children to keep your line going, because everything else, if you don't do that, everything else falls apart. And when that happens is why the Middle Ages are so terrible. I check that out if you're kind of in that. If you like Civilization, those kinds of games, which I do, I love, I'm nerdy that way. I think you'll find that a very good option. In terms of analog board games that are dealing with politics in interesting ways, one of my favorite innovative designs of the last couple of years is called High Treason, The Trial of Louis Riel. And the reason I like it is threefold. First of all, it's a card-driven game. It's political in nature, but it's about a treason trial in Canada. So right off the bat, you can't get more obscure than a treason trial in Canada in terms of American history. Like, who the hell knows anything about that if you happen to be an American? In Canada, it's, like a holiday or something. But it also applies a card-driven mechanism to a courtroom, which is super interesting to me. And he does that very successfully. And it's very fast and it's very elegant, and it teaches a clever historical lesson. So I think it's a game that people, should check out. It came from a small publisher, so that's, you have to kind of dig around for it. And I think some interesting things are happening in the solo game sphere. I don't play a lot of solo games personally, but I ordered and I'm very excited about this game called The Mission, which is about the development of early Christianity and kind of the political resistance and ultimately, of course, the Muslim invasion that eliminates Christianity from a lot of the Mediterranean. Anyway, I think that has a lot of cool politics in it. I have sitting on my shelf that I can't think of the name all of a sudden, but the No Motherland Without is what it's called, a game about the political tensions and dynamics within North Korea throughout its existence. And so I think just the fact that someone is trying to tell that story through a board game, a story that most Americans will not be familiar with at all, is an incredible development for the hobby.
Yeah. I would also add this new game, Imperial Struggle. It's great. David adds that about anything about near future events or like, China US competition or things like that in the hobby industry, and not just in the, I know it's very big right now in the professional wargaming and the DoD arena.
Yes, they do seem suddenly interested in the Chinese. Obviously Harold Buchanan has a very kind of elegant simulation coming out on competition in the South China Sea from GMT. And I think near future semi-speculative conflict simulations between the United States and China, or some amalgamation of US allies in China, that'll probably be all the rage eventually. When I was young, there were three categories really of war game. There was World War II, the Civil War, and war games about fighting the Russians or the Soviets. That kind of fell away, maybe prematurely, but anyway. So I think that the Chinese seem to be aiming to fill that gap for us in game design.
With that, those are so all of our questions, or as many as you could get to.
Excellent.
So I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank you for speaking to us, and we all learned a lot. I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone here, and I really appreciate your time, and thanks so much for being here.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.